Good evening from our nation's capital to those in the eastern and central states. Good afternoon to those in the mountain states on the West Coast and in Hawaii. I am Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 66 venues throughout the country to our 7th annual China Town Hall Local Connections National Reflections. We created China Town Hall in the belief that U.S.-China relations are the defining relationship of the 21st century, and that getting that relationship right is the key to peace and stability throughout the world. Pick up any newspaper or magazine, watch or listen to any television or radio news program, and there is a story about China or about the U.S.-China relationship. China's economic and strategic decisions now affect every corner of the United States and the world. We are fortunate to have with us tonight an extraordinary American, Madeleine Albright, who under President Clinton was our first female permanent representative of the United Nations, and then our first female Secretary of State. She now chairs the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and too many other firms to name. Her accomplishments are also too long to list, so let me only mention that last year, President Obama chose Secretary Albright to receive the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in recognition of her contributions to international peace and democracy. Before beginning, I would like to thank our partners at all 66 venues and our small but very dedicated National Committee staff, which has done a magnificent job in coordinating this complex nationwide event. Let me also thank our speakers, none of whom is paid. A veritable who's who of China experts in America. They have traveled throughout the country to talk with you because they believe, as we do, that educating Americans about China will help fashion policies that are in the long-term interest of the United States. In addition, we thank the Star Foundation for funding this exciting program. Last, but certainly not least, I thank Secretary Albright for joining us today. I've had the privilege of watching Secretary Albright give talks like this throughout her career, and I know we are in for a treat today. We are now accepting questions submitted electronically from our venues. We will get to as many as we can and apologize in advance to those whose questions we don't have time to answer. Let me now turn the floor over to Secretary Albright.
Steve, thank you very, very much. And to our friends across the country, good evening to you all. I would like to thank you officially, Steve Orlins, for that very, very warm introduction, and the National Committee on United States-China Relations for inviting me to share this evening with you. I want to congratulate the National Committee for doing such a fine job in bringing together people to learn more about what I consider to be the most important bilateral relationship of this century. In many ways, the National Committee, founded 6 years before President Nixon's historic trip to Beijing, was very much, to quote, present at the creation. You've done so much to deepen our bilateral relationship with China over the last 4 decades. As we look to the future, the key question is whether the United States and China can work together to solve the world's important challenges despite different economic systems and divergent views on such matters as democracy, religious freedom, civil liberties, and the rule of law. In my view, this is certainly possible, so long as we recognize our disagreements and core differences with maturity, confront our challenges directly, and have leaders on both sides that are committed to this relationship. So tonight, I'd like to share my thoughts on how current American and Chinese leaders see the relationship and what is required of us in order to build a new model of bilateral relations, which both Presidents Obama and Xi have referenced as a possible unifying goal. My own perspective on this subject extends back several decades to the mid-1970s when I first began working in Washington. President Carter was in the White House, where I served on his national security staff. My job was to maintain good relations with Congress, an assignment that has often been compared then and now to herding cats. In that role, I accompanied a Senate delegation to China along with my mentor, the late Senator Edmund Muskie. Our goal was to persuade Congress that the time for normalized relations had come. Our countries did not know much about each other then, and we had to rely on magazines and history books for information. Some were great, but others circulated information that was inaccurate, distorted, or just plain wrong. And yet, by and large, American leaders kept an open mind and imagined that such a new relationship, what it would look like. The same was true for the Chinese, so we charted a new path and established formal ties in 1979. Now, almost 35 years later, that moment of connection continues to shape both our countries and the world. In my years of experience, I've learned that good relations between leaders matter a great deal. At the United Nations, I worked closely with my Chinese counterpart Li Xiaojing, and he went on to serve as Chinese ambassador here in Washington at the same time that as I served as Secretary of State. The trust that we developed was crucial in our pursuit of bilateral cooperation. Of course, good relationships alone are not always enough. My working history with Li Xiaojing did not make it any easier for us to deal with the United States' accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the war in Kosovo. But it did serve as a valuable bedrock for enhancing engagement between our countries. I believe that overall our relationship with China today is positive and complementary. Our annual bilateral trade now exceeds $500 billion, and in June, Presidents Obama and Xi committed to a significant and concrete goal to reduce emissions that contribute to climate change. But as in any other relationship, there have been and will continue to be stresses and challenges. The economic imbalances between our countries pose legitimate questions about the health of our relationship, and recent tightening on the freedoms of journalists, lawyers, public advocates, and social media in China is very troubling. As a result, Americans continue to raise questions about China's growing influence, the imbalance in trade, controversy over currency exchange rates, and Beijing's unique and opaque political system. Whichever way our leaders choose to respond to these concerns, their policies should be based not on emotion but reason, not on myth but fact. There's ample opportunity to do this, as I believe we are at a crucial moment in the relationship, a moment leaders on both sides recognize that we have to seize. Both countries have recently completed their respective leadership transitions. President Obama, almost a year into his second term, has already redoubled his administration's efforts to enhance our presence in Asia. Diplomatically, economically, and militarily, we must continue to rebalance to Asia. For almost 70 years, our nation has paid in both blood and treasure to guarantee peace and stability in the region, and Asia has benefited from Washington's engagement. Our agenda is simple. We want to reassure our allies by providing security and stability in the region. We want to maintain a reliable and credible governing architecture. We want to bolster lasting institutions where nations can resolve their differences. And we want to advance economic relationships throughout the region through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By opening up markets, we can unleash the incredible human potential in Asia so that living standards can continue to rise. Perhaps more than many of his predecessors, President Obama has shown a personal interest in Asia. Having spent part of his childhood there, he has referred to himself often as America's first Pacific president. This must continue. We need to send a strong message that the United States is as much a Pacific nation as it is an Atlantic nation. And China, too, has just completed a political transition, with President Xi now at the helm. He has shown a deep interest not only in building stronger ties with the United States, but also in our country itself. I had the opportunity to meet then Vice President Xi in February 2012 when the Chinese embassy hosted a small dinner in honor of his visit to the United States. That evening, he told us about his days in Iowa on an exchange program. He said he'd kept in touch with his hosts and fondly recalled the generosity he encountered, his love for Mark Twain, and the beauty of Muscatine at sunset. In our conversation, he appeared to be very much attuned to the needs of his domestic constituents and has since taken on populist themes to enhance his and the party's credibility with the Chinese people. The openness that Presidents Obama and Xi have displayed with one another and in their one-on-one interactions at the Sunnyland Summit in June show that our bilateral relationship is becoming not only more regularized, but also more personalized. I continue to travel to China frequently, and many of the other new senior leaders have been impressive. They often speak to me about the Chinese dream, a new aspiration coined by Xi himself, which supposedly aims to bring greater prosperity and comfort to a broader swath of China. I suspect that these leaders realize that for the Chinese dream to materialize, they have no choice but to work closely with the United States, for our two societies are increasingly bound together. This doesn't mean that we will always agree, and Americans will always speak out for our core values: freedom, market-based capitalism, democracy, and the advancement of a rules-based order where all nations can thrive. As chair of the National Democratic Institute, I often wrestle with these deeply profound issues. I've raised them with the Chinese during bilateral dialogues our two countries have co-hosted, including at one that brought representatives from the American Democratic and Republican parties together with their Chinese Communist Party counterparts to discuss political party development. We may have our disagreements, but dialogues such as these are important channels to make our views clear and to confront our differences. And I think that this kind of regular, frank interaction is what the two presidents had in mind when they spoke of the need to build a new model of bilateral relations at the Sunnyland Summit in June. Despite our differences, we must ask ourselves, can we work together to solve some of the thorniest bilateral and global issues of our time? Will we promote the development of international institutions and advance peace in trouble spots from Syria to the Korean Peninsula? Will we move forward with all nations to safeguard innovation and intellectual property by fighting cybercrimes and recent irritant in the relationship? Will China assume the responsibility of a global stakeholder, helping to keep the peace and upholding the rule of law around the world? Rhetorical questions are, of course, easy to ask but painful to answer, and it's always easier to recite goals than to achieve them. But if a new model of bilateral relations provides a framework for two fundamentally different nations to resolve these challenges, then perhaps it is a worthy goal for us to pursue together. So in that spirit, as we write the next chapter in our bilateral relationship, I want to close tonight by seeking some insight from the past. In many years of study and practice in diplomacy, I have learned that nothing is inevitable, not America's achievement of greatness, nor China's march toward it. The progress of history is delicate, and a nation's path through it must be constantly maintained, perfected, and reassessed. Over 40 years ago, an American president arrived in China and began a relationship that has moved the world in ways that few could have imagined. Since then, we've had 7 successive U.S. administrations, and all have endeavored to maintain stable relations with China, even as domestic partnership ebbed and flowed and events challenged the strength of our ties. Across the Pacific, 5 Chinese governments have done the same. We have seen crisis and tensions from Tiananmen to Taiwan, from commercial frictions to cyber aggressions. Yet we have managed them as best we could, because being honest about these issues while finding areas ripe for bilateral cooperation are equally important to American national interests. In this moment in time, our relationship must continue to mature. Washington does not want to carry all the world's burdens, and we want Beijing to assume a role in global leadership. This is something that we Americans should welcome for the benefit of our own citizens and those around the world. So with history as a source of insight, with maturity and vigilance as defining characters of actions, and with the hope of a stable and prosperous world as a guide, there's every reason to believe that we can advance this relationship for another 40 years and beyond. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Secretary Albright. I think that talk reminds us why you've been such an inspirational leader to so many women and men in the United States. I'm sure I could hear the applause in all the 66 venues. Let me use the moderator's prerogative and just ask one question tonight. This will be the only one I will ask, which is, you said Washington does not want to carry all the world's burdens, and we want Beijing to assume a role in global leadership. How can Beijing assume this role without usurping the Americans' role and creating tension in kind of the policy-making community in the United States?
Well, I have from the very beginning said that the United States is the indispensable nation. I said it at the United Nations and I said it as secretary, but there is nothing in the word indispensable that says alone. And I believe the kinds of issues that are out there that have to be dealt with require partnership. So how to deal with terrorism without creating more terrorists, how to deal with nuclear proliferation, how to deal with the issues that are energy, environment, global pandemics, how to deal with the growing gap between the rich and the poor, require us to have partners. And I believe the Chinese, if they look at those issues that I mentioned, also have an interest in dealing with them. And so I think in a spirit of partnership to try to keep the world, that we have a natural way of working together.
First question from Grand Rapids, Dixie. China has commented on the dysfunction of our government with respect to our budget process and debt ceiling debate. How do you think this might impact the economic relationship between the two countries?
I have to say, I recently had a discussion with a Chinese official, and he asked me, so what is going on in your country? And I explained that we have a two-party system and we argue in the open. They have a one-party system and they argue underneath that umbrella. And basically, I think that in many ways arguments are useful. Compromise is more important. I do think that the Chinese are looking at us in terms of what is going on. However, the government is functioning. There are discussions going on our economic relationship, and ultimately I think the Chinese do recognize also that we are the power that we are and that we will get our act together.
From Twitter, and Peter from the University of Pittsburgh, Obama's pivot to Asia and China's military rise are feeding mutual distrust. Is there a way out?
I think what's interesting on the rebalancing to Asia is it depends on who is talking about it. I think that there is a group in China and a group in the United States that does see kind of military threats from each other. And the Chinese believe that we are trying to contain them. And we believe, some of those that advocate this more robust view, that the Chinese are moving out and have aircraft carriers and submarines, and that they are a threat. I think that there's another part to this, which is that we do, as I mentioned in my remarks, have many issues in common that we should be trying to work together on. The problem is that if you only listen to those that are suspicious of the relationship, it kind of becomes a vicious circle.
Anne in Beijing, via Twitter, asks, at Sunnylands we saw a new type of U.S.-China communication, no scripted talking points. That seems to me essential to building trust and cooperation. Can it continue?
One would hope so. I think one of the hard parts about any official meeting, officials are always handed talking points, and I will very much remember a real discussion that I had with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Chen Chi-chen, at the time. And I said, here are my talking points, give me your talking points, and let's have a strategic discussion. And I do think that the kind of discussion that the two presidents had, the No Necktie Summit, as it was known, I think did help to build a relationship between these two leaders, but ultimately we are going to have to work across the whole board of our government and theirs in order to build that relationship.
From Orion at the Middlebury College venue, what do you view as the most significant debate within the U.S. foreign policy community with respect to China policy, and what are your personal views with respect to that debate?
I think that the debate is one basically as to how much of our debt and our economy is dependent on Chinese activities. So I think to a great extent it's an economic discussion. We obviously want to have a balanced trading relationship with the Chinese, and we want to have jobs created. We like their market, we need their market. So I think mostly looking at it from both angles, in terms of those who favor more economic relationship with the Chinese, they see it positively, than those who fear the relationship that the Chinese are taking advantage of us. So that is the largest part of the relationship. And then there also are strategic issues in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, a real desire to have China have a global role. Will they take advantage of that global role because they're energy hungry and they need resources, and so is what they're doing abroad more a resource hunt than global partnership. So it's a complicated relationship. I think one of the things that one always says in diplomacy when there are many issues, that it's a multifaceted relationship. So we do have this multifaceted relationship with the Chinese.
This is Chris from Baltimore. It could be said that the U.S. and China are investing in emerging markets based on divergent models. How can our two nations work together in these areas? I think meaning this is an AID model. Their Chinese aid model and our aid model are quite different.
Well, I think that that's true, and it's kind of what I alluded to in the previous answer. We are a generous country, and we do give assistance in a variety of ways. We often condition it in some way, that we want to see certain changes in having the rule of law or commercial codes or democracy, and the Chinese basically give grants. And I was in a country in Africa not long ago, and there were discussions about whether a road should be built through one of the wild areas where the animals are. And we had all kinds of environmental regulations, and the Chinese came and said, where do you want it? So there is a difference, and I think it does make some people nervous in terms of how quickly the Chinese go into a country, and the aid issues, but also the kind of deals that they make. So my views here generally are that we need to have a really much more expanded relationship with the Chinese, but we don't have to accept everything that they do. And we have our role as we discuss what American national interests are.
This is Doug without a venue. Do you think the current crackdown on media, academics, and others in China will continue? And if so, should the U.S. confront China about these restrictions?
Well, let me say always, in this multifaceted relationship that I mentioned, there was not a time that I didn't meet with the Chinese that I didn't raise issues that had to do with human rights and religious freedom and various academic issues or whatever are very much our core values. One has to do this. I think that when you have a relationship and you're developing a friendship, you have to be frank. And we don't do any favors, certainly to our people or theirs, if we don't talk about these things. So I wouldn't ever pull any punches on these issues. I think that is the normal standard for American diplomats and leaders, and I think that we have to keep stating what we believe in. And the Chinese people are hearing it more and more. We have to be true to the core values that we profess and respond to their questions about what we're doing in a frank and honest way.
Mm-hmm. This is via Twitter from Clifton. The U.S. invited the Chinese Navy to participate in RIMPAC 2014, joint naval exercises in the Pacific that include many of China's neighbors. How will this impact U.S.-Japan relations?
Well, this is one of the more complex issues, and part of it does have to do with the fact that the Chinese Navy is expanding. They are developing a blue water navy, and we are recently reading about new submarines that they have. And we are concerned generally about some of the aspects of expansion of the Chinese in the South China Sea, East China Sea. But one of the issues that is out there is specifically the Sino-Japanese relationship and the conflicts that they're already having about certain islands. We have a treaty of alliance with the Japanese, and we will obviously continue to make that very clear, but it does not preclude us from having exercises with other countries. But I think it's very clear to people that there is a concern about what is going on between China and Japan, potentially nervous-making.
This is Jim from Madison, Wisconsin. With China holding such a large portion of our debt, is the U.S. at particular risk vis-a-vis diplomatic relations? By the way, I think China holds less than 10%. So the basis of that question may...
Well, clearly, I think that this, on a previous question when you asked, what is the major subject of discussion, it is this economic issue and who is dependent upon whom. There is no question that we have a symbiotic relationship on the economic issues. The Chinese do hold a portion of our debt. They need us for their markets. And so it is very much not a subject that's apart from diplomacy. And that the talks that we have with the Chinese are on a strategic level and an economic level and a number of aspects that all go together in this multifaceted relationship.
From Patrick O'Connor in one of our Massachusetts venues, do you believe China's emerging involvement in Africa and the Mideast will harm U.S.-China relations in the coming decades?
I think that the question is whether we operate in a way where some of our approaches in other emerging markets or other areas are complementary or competitive. And again, I think it's very hard to have a generalization there. I think in some areas we have complementary aspects of trying to figure out what to do. And in others, we are competitors. And some of this has to do with the Chinese style of just doing grants or deals and really going into countries where they are searching for resources. So potentially, I think that there may be some really competitive aspects to it. And this is the real question as to how diplomatically you handle developing a relationship where we want to see them take some global responsibility, at the same time being somewhat nervous about some of the things they do.
How do you think about, as our energy independence approaches and our reliance on Mideast oil becomes virtually nil by 2020, how do you see the U.S.-China relationship playing out in the Mideast in that context, where China is becoming heavily reliant on Mideast oil, the U.S. is becoming independent of Mideast oil, yet our Navy protects those sea lanes?
Well, I think there are obviously changes in the energy picture, but I personally have never believed that our only interest in the Middle East is over oil. We have a strategic interest in the Middle East. We will, I believe, have a presence of some kind there for the foreseeable future. I do think also in the oil story, the United States, even if we do become energy independent, are concerned about global oil prices. So it isn't as if we're just completely out of the oil story. And also, the Chinese may behave in a different way if they need the oil out of the Middle East in terms of helping promote stability. I think the bottom line is we don't quite know yet, but I do believe that we are not totally abandoning the Middle East in order to have either the Russians or the Chinese take it over.
Yeah, does it require rebalancing of our kind of activities in the Mideast?
Well, you know what's interesting is I was asked a question after the, so somebody said to me, so what do you think about President Obama's rebalancing to Asia, and what are you going to do about West Asia? And I thought, what is West Asia? Well, West Asia is the Middle East, so we are not out of there completely, and I think that the United States is a country that does have global responsibilities, and we are not just going to abandon certain areas.
From Colby College, what's your opinion about the strict restriction towards Tibetans and foreigners going into Tibet and its effect on the issues between China and Tibet and other minority groups?
I have always been troubled about what has been going on between the Chinese and the Tibetans and what has happened in Tibet. I think this is one of the issues that is always raised in diplomatic conversations of all kinds, and the restrictions in terms of how the Tibetans are treated and then access to Tibet itself. So I think it is one of the more troubling aspects, and I also think we simply have to speak out when something akin to what is really isolating a very important area of the world, or where people's rights are not honored. We have to speak out about it, and I've never agreed with people who have thought that the U.S.-Chinese relationship is so important that you don't raise those issues. You have to raise those issues on a regular basis.
This is from Baton Rouge at LSU. Should we expect China to take on the role of peacekeeper in the future? If so, then will China operate under UN auspices or as its own peacekeeping entity? That's the question I would note. I believe China has over 2,000 peacekeepers operating under UN auspices presently.
What is interesting is that there was a time that peacekeeping operations before the end of the Cold War, that the permanent members of the Security Council usually did not take part in them. The peacekeeping operations have changed a lot. We did a lot in the 90s to kind of look at how they should be operating in a post-Cold War scenario. And the Chinese now do have, as you mentioned, over 1,000 peacekeepers, and they do operate within the UN mandates. So that is something that has changed. What was interesting when I was at the UN was that the Chinese did not really like to participate in a lot of international discussions. They mostly abstained on votes, and it was part of, were they really global partners in anything, because they really didn't participate. They now are, in fact, participating in peacekeeping, and from everything that I know, they do abide by the UN mandates, and they do contribute. They contribute actually more troops than we do at this point.
Yes. This is, again, don't know the venue. George, how should the United States react to China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, as well as potential energy independence from claims in the South China Sea?
Generally, I think that there is concern about what the Chinese activities are in the South China Sea and competition over certain islands with some of our allies. And the fact that they want to deal with these issues on a bilateral basis, whether it's with the Philippines or Vietnam or Japan. And we believe that there needs to be some kind of international structure that allows there to become kind of rules of the road for the area. In various meetings that I've participated in, this is very much a subject on people's minds, and one that is worrisome, not just in the Chinese-Japanese relationship, but with our other allies in the region. And I think people are concerned. They're also concerned about an accident that could happen, that some fishing vessels are there and there could be a ramming or something that happens, and that there's not a system of kind of hotlines or anything that would make sure that an accident might not escalate into something worse. So the bottom line is people are concerned about it. There's no question. And some of it has to do with resources, and some of it just has to do with a territorial expansion. But I think of the various areas that concern people in our relationship with China, that one is right up there.
This is an interesting question from Roro in New Haven, Connecticut. With our growing economic stratification, can the United States learn from China's rapidly growing income gap, or will it be the other way around?
I can't see that we would learn on this. We obviously have very different systems, and I think that they have not dealt very well with their income gap. That's what I have found interesting. For a one-party state, they have gaps between the rich and the poor, also between urban and rural, and so I think we have more to teach them, but they aren't really looking at our system for teaching. But I do not think that we could learn much from a one-party state.
Let's see, SAR at the University of Pittsburgh. University of Pittsburgh has asked the most questions today. What programs, if any, is China developing to address the issue of air pollution, especially in Beijing? Before this program started, you in fact mentioned visiting Beijing when the air was dense with pollution and fog.
Well, I think unless you've been there, it's much worse than even looking at pictures in our newspapers or on TV. You can't see out the window of your hotel, and it looks like it's dark in the middle of the day. They have tried various things. They managed to deal with things during the Olympics in terms of having alternate driving days and a variety of different things. I do think that there has been a step forward in terms of the agreement that President Obama and President Xi reached on some rules on emissions. And the question is to what extent the Chinese will live up to what they're doing and move away from coal. But they know what their problems are. Right. I mean, and my own sense from being there is that people, they cannot go into they are the world's second largest economy, but how they can't do it in this particular way. There's no question. And they have to figure out a way to deal with it. Fewer cars or emissions, but they know they've got a problem.
Yeah, it was interesting to see that the Chinese government today announced that they're going to be studying the link between this pollution and health issues.
Yeah.
It's
a tough admission to make, I have to say, though. When you can't breathe or see, ultimately you have to do something.
Judy in Iowa, could you comment on U.S. concerns over Chinese cyber spying and Chinese concerns over U.S. monitoring of everything and everyone?
Well, obviously this is the issue of the day. We have been concerned about what the Chinese have been doing in the cyber area, and primarily, I'm going to say something again, countries do spy on each other. I think that it is what has happened for hundreds of years. But there are different kinds of, when you're looking at national security issues, kind of what does one country have in its military, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things that have gone on. What is troubling now is what people kind of call the spying, of stealing intellectual property, of basically espionage economically, especially because the Chinese have state-owned enterprises, and so it's kind of how they operate, who gets the benefits from it. The Chinese, I think, we need to establish some whole new way of trying to figure out how we deal in this cyber age, because we don't have any rules of the road. And I think as the issues have come out in the United States and other places, there needs to be a discussion of this and establishing some rules. But basically, what we have objected to is the cyber espionage in the industrial area.
Right. George, again, it doesn't say the venue. How do you feel that China will balance expenditures on military growth with expenditure on looming healthcare costs associated with an aging population?
I think that one of the things I have to say whenever I go to China and you think about the size of the country and their problems and how they deal with the discrepancies and the divisions within their own society, and that they don't like to admit that they're going on, I think that they do have to figure out that they have an aging population, mostly supported by one child as a result of the One China policy, and at the same time have to do with issues in terms of, do they want to expand their military, how much, and they, as any country, are trying to figure out the balance. They have a hard time. This is a huge population that, as many problems as the United States has at this moment, they are not anywhere near the kinds of issues that the Chinese have to deal with, and I think we are more honest in terms of admitting where our problems are. So that is something that they have to sort out.
This is from Frank, who's at the DePaul University venue in Chicago. How will China's investments in Latin America, a lot closer to home than Africa and the Mideast, affect its relationship with the United States?
Well, again, I think we are watching very carefully. I think that I remember when I was in office, I went down to the Panama Canal, and watching Chinese ships there was something that made people nervous. And then there are other places where we feel that this is the Western Hemisphere. But I think we have to get used to the fact that the Chinese, we can't have it both ways. If we want them to be partners or play a global role of responsibility, they're going to be global. And the best thing about the United States is we are innovative, we have a democracy, we know how to respect other countries, and so I am not afraid of the competition, but we have to get our act back together and also give a real leg up to those who have innovative ideas.
We've talked about now Latin America, Asia, the Mideast, and Africa. How about investment in the United States? What do you think the implications of that are for the relationship?
Well, I think actually we should welcome investments in the United States, depending upon in what area it is. But I think that there are certain places where we want to see Chinese investment that create jobs, that help us in a number of ways. So it depends on the investment, but I really do think that for the most part, people want to see Chinese investment in the United States.
Yeah. From Andrew, asked this via Twitter, do you think that Nixon and Kissinger's realpolitik approach to China is the most effective one?
Well, it's interesting. It certainly worked. And as I met, Nixon and Kissinger did open China up. I have finally gotten my way through Kissinger's book on China, and it's fascinating in terms of the way that all was laid out and worked. I think that we have as I mentioned in my remarks, other presidents of the United States have followed up on a relationship with China. I think we do have to do it with eyes open, but the bottom line is we cannot forget about our value system. And I really do think it's essential when Americans go to China that we can't some apologize for various parts. I mean, I believe in democracy, and I also think that ultimately the Chinese would be more stable if they allowed more openness and had the capability of listening to some of their smart people in terms of ideas they have about the evolution of Chinese politics.
This earpiece is telling me we have 20 seconds left, but I want to thank you for what I could only describe as a tour de force in the U.S.-China relationship in these descriptions. As promised, I've heard Secretary Albright do this before, and she has done it spectacularly tonight. So thank you so much for being with us. And to all of our venues, enjoy the speakers that you have. Learn as much as you can about China, and if you want to visit us, you can visit us at NCUSCR.org. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the honor. I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you.